looks like it looks like most of the tables have been served now. So we want to press on with our program so that we can get out of here on schedule before 1:30. And at this time, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Mr. Art Washuta, Vice President of AECOM's Alberta North District, to bring greetings from AECOM, the executive sponsor of CSCE 2012, and also to introduce Dr. Percy. Art, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon. Thank you, Jeff. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I'd just like to say that AECOM is very pleased and proud of being the executive sponsor for this celebration of CSCE's 125th anniversary, and this conference with a very appropriate theme of leadership in sustainable infrastructure. When Jeff first approached me about this sponsorship, I made him promise this would be the biggest and best CSCE conference ever. And I think the organizing committee, co-chaired by Drs. DiBattista and Driver, two of the most creative and dynamic engineers in the room here, Mr. Mandel, and the organizing committee and many volunteers, totaling about 50 dedicated people, I think have truly delivered a great event. So congratulations to all involved, and thank you all for attending. In particular, I'd like to thank the city and the province, on behalf of all the engineers in the room, for your genuine commitment to ongoing investment in sustainable infrastructure. AECOM has a long history of providing consulting engineering services on civil engineering projects across the country, including numerous major infrastructure projects here in the Edmonton area, such as the North LRT extension that I'm hoping many of you will tour tomorrow. So, welcome and best wishes to a highly informative and enjoyable conference. I'm now honored to introduce Dr. Michael Percy, our keynote speaker this afternoon. Dr. Percy received his Bachelor of Arts from the University of Victoria and a Master of Arts degree and a doctoral degree both in economics from Queen's University. Dr. Percy served as a member of the Legislative Assembly of Alberta from 1993 to 1997. He then took the helm for the next 15 years as Dean of the Alberta School of Business at the University of Alberta, retiring from that position just last year. Dr. Percy is the author and co-author of 4 books and numerous articles on public policy, international trade, and economic development. Dr. Percy has served on the editorial boards of the Canadian Journal of Economics, is an active commentator on current public policy issues. Always active in the business community, Dr. Percy has served on numerous boards including EPCOR, STARS, Cabro Income Trust, Timber Investments Limited, and ATB. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Percy.
Well, it's former Premier Stelmach, Minister Drysdale, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure to be here to address the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering. Certainly, as Mayor Mandel said, I mean, this is a profession that builds. And I won't bring forth any Dilbert jokes. Being an economist, of course, there are more than enough jokes going around, so anything I said, I would get back many-fold. So what I'd like to do in my presentation is, I've always found that good luncheon talk is kind of general in nature. I recall once I had been on the expert panel on equalization and territorial funding formula, and 15 minutes into a luncheon talk, as I saw the heads hit the table, I knew I could inflict pain. So after an experience like that, what I want to do is focus on what I think are some general trends and takeaways for today. So I'm going to start by giving you my punchline, That way, if you do leave early, you really haven't missed much except why I'm going to justify the point of view that I have. So bottom line, I think there are tremendous pressures in the short and medium terms that are going to force governments to be far more innovative in the way that they fund infrastructure. So I see a world where P3s, user pay models, toll roads, backdoor clawbacks, all are going to be the norm. Alternate financing is going to dominate rather than just government pays all directly. So let me give you my rationale, starting with the global context and then narrowing the focus. First, a financial crisis the magnitude we experienced in 2008-2009 does have long-lived consequences and really is a game changer. Financial crises driven by speculative bubbles are by their very nature lead to dramatic increases in debt, and they're leveraging exercises. And you see governments, business, and households lever up dramatically. And it's the nature of bubbles that occurs. And again, we use the term bubble frequently, but the best way of thinking about a bubble is to think about asset prices relative to the flow of services. House is the asset, the rent of that house is the flow of services, and the housing bubble just saw remarkable increases in the price of housing relative to what you could rent that house at. And of course, the nature of bubbles is you borrow and you speculate, you hope there's a bigger fool out there that will then purchase that asset that you have bought. When in fact you end up being the fool at the end of the line, you have an asset worth far less than the debt that you currently owe. And that's the nature of a speculative bubble and the housing bubble. So, when you see that bubble burst, what occurs is dramatic deleveraging by households and businesses. And we've seen that in virtually every economy, except, of course, Canada, where household debt, actually, we're still continuing to lever up. And conversely, what you see is that governments become very active in stimulus and in backstopping firms and industries that are seen too big to fail. So deleveraging by households and firms, increased leveraging by, in fact, governments, as they attempt to pump stimulus in and backstop chosen entities. Right now, we are seeing most industrialized economies in the process of seeing businesses and household sectors deleverage. And in fact, notwithstanding the bad press the United States gets, when you look at economies that are successfully deleveraging, particularly in the household side and on the corporate side, it's the United States. They're basically, on that side of the ledger, the poster child for success. And when you look at overall debt levels, and here I'm going to rely on a clearly reputable source, the CIA World Fact Book, because you can look at any number of sources, IMF, World Bank, and they tend to differ on the numbers. When you look at public debt, and this would be total public debt, sub-jurisdictions as well as federal, total public debt as a share of GDP ranges from 230% in Japan, 161% in Greece, 120% Italy, 82% in Germany, 82% UK, 84% in Canada, 69% in the US. So we have relatively high debt levels, relatively low in North America relative to our tax effort and capacity to fund that debt. But the bottom line for many industrialized economies, they are at their margin at which if they borrow more, there's going to be consequences from bond rating agencies and debt servicing costs will rise. So you take that as a backdrop, high levels of debt in industrialized economies. You overlay on that the euro crisis, and that was brought about by housing bubbles in Spain and Ireland, profligate government borrowing in Greece and Italy, and just the structural deficiencies in the eurozone. Canada is a common currency area like the euro area, except we have mechanisms like equalization, regionally differentiated unemployment insurance, regional development strategies that allows the gains in booming regions to be transferred to non-booming regions. And note to Thomas Mulcair that Canada actually works. And so there are mechanisms that we have in play. But you take then the leveraging that governments have done to, as a consequence of the financial crisis, you overlay that with the consequences of the euro crisis, and there is no capacity on the margin for many industrialized economies to borrow. The end of the day, that if they attempt to finance infrastructure, attempt to finance consumption programs, they're going to get a pretty mean eye from bond rating agencies. And then we're also going to see debt servicing costs really squeeze out efforts to fund infrastructure and other types of social programs. So at the end of the day, industrialized economies will have no other alternative than to look to alternative financing. And I'll go in that a little more detail. So you can take that as a given. There are those pressures out there that we know have arisen from a combination of the financial meltdown and the euro crisis. The second issue facing industrialized economies is, in fact, the demography working against us. If you look at most industrialized economies, total fertility is below replacement levels. And there's a very simple consequence that arises from that. An aging population and labor force participation rates that decline. Aging populations demand more, particularly health care. Labor force is shrinking and labor force participation is declining. So a smaller tax base has to meet somehow increased demands for public expenditures. And either you cut expenditures or increase tax effort, or you look for alternate mechanisms to finance the demands on government. And infrastructure is one where there are a variety of alternate financing mechanisms. So fiscal pressures will inevitably require governments to be creative in the way in which they invest in infrastructure, simply because of the constraints of demography and debt levels. Now, my third point is actually positive after the kind of the gloomy review of the pressures currently facing industrialized economies. There's a study out there by McKinsey Global Institute, and it came out in December 2010. And they look at the world's capacity to finance capital investment to the year 2030. And they look at both industrialized economies but emerging economies. And in this paper, they argue that by 2030, the global demand for investment will likely reach 24 trillion from its 11 trillion level in 2008. And a significant portion of that is, in fact, public infrastructure. But they argue that when you look at what's going to generate the savings, the combination of an aging population, saving less, consuming more, shifts in emerging economies from rural to urban, and the emergent middle class that consumes more, saves less, all of which is going to lead likely to shortfalls in the pool of savings relative to investment demand, and as a consequence, an increase in real interest rates in the longer term. So you look at the debt constraints facing industrialized economies, you look at the implications of demography, and then you look at the implications of what's going to emerge as a consequence of growth in the emerging economies. And industrialized economies are going to be squeezed and will not have the capacity to rely upon traditional ways of financing infrastructure. Now, I have another fourth reason, and this is more of a leap in faith, but nonetheless, I think it to be true. Actually, notwithstanding the fact I was in the legislature for 4 years, I believe that governments do adopt new organizational and financing paradigms, but with a significant lag relative to the private sector. You've seen it in terms of province of Alberta was the first in Canada to move forward with business plans and metrics to observe progress on achieving goals. You're seeing the federal government increasingly business-like in the way that it structures its activities and its focus on metrics. But more importantly, you see in government an ongoing discussion about what is core to their activities and what is not. And we see discussions about the role of government in steering, not rowing. And this perspective inevitably leads to more consideration of outsourcing, privatization, and alternate mechanisms for financing. Neither firms nor governments want to end up like Kodak or Blockbuster, one-time great firms driven out of existence because they did not know their core business. You know, Blockbuster thought it was DVDs as opposed to entertainment services. Kodak thought it was film as opposed to photographic images, regardless of the medium. Governments are a little wiser than that, and as I say, as they look at core, what in fact do they exist for, that clearly will lead them to look at alternate financing. It will clearly lead them to further outsourcing of things that are really non-core. Governments will set standards, but basically rely upon third parties to generate the outcomes under a pretty clear set of rules of the game. So, you know, am I blindly optimistic when I look to a variety of demographic and financial pressures leading to more innovative finance and infrastructure? And I don't think I am. I mean, you can show me a silver lining, and I'll discuss the cloud in great detail. Now, you say, given these pressures, though, why haven't we seen as rapid adoption of P3s and user pay mechanisms in Canada and other North American jurisdictions? Well, a number of points. One is the issue, one of them is the allocation of risk and the role of auditor generals. I think auditor generals are great people. I think they're very focused on controls and process. And, but it's a world where your successes are taken for granted, but your missteps are highly publicized. And that tends to lead then governments to be a little risk averse as they go down the P3 road because of this asymmetry. As well, when you look, you know, taxpayers demand accountability, yet the type of accountability structures that we have in play make it very difficult to move quickly. And in fact, to, in a sense, specify outcomes, but not necessarily the structure and process of achieving those outcomes. So just the mechanics of achieving P3s tend to be difficult given these accountability structures and the role then that entities like auditor generals play. And the other bottom line, of course, is that long-lived returns are always trumped by short-term pressures. You know, if you look at healthcare, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that prevention trumps treatment. If you look at children at risk, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that if you invest at children in risk, there's tremendous cost avoidance. The reality is long-lived payoffs are heavily discounted, and it's the short-term pressures and payoffs that win. And infrastructure is up against that. So when you look out there and you say, this project meets every conceivable criteria in terms of private and social returns, why isn't it being funded? Simply ask, why aren't we investing in prevention? Why aren't we investing in children at risk? You're in exactly the same position because of the nature of returns generated from these types of platform investments. So, do I think we'll see a turnaround in Canada in terms of greater penetration of alternate financing mechanisms? And I do. Certainly, as I look out there, notwithstanding our debt levels, I think when you look, even though we have a fertility rate that's below replacement, it's about 1.9, international migration is an increasingly important source of population growth, and immigrants tend to cluster in large urban centers. So there's going to be continued pressure for infrastructure, even if Canada, like many industrialized economies, has a below replacement level fertility rate. As well, amenities and quality of life are important detractors as we compete for immigrants. And the Mayor mentioned that, as did Minister Drysdale. And urban communities with high quality public infrastructure are absolutely fundamental if we are to capture our share of footloose international immigrants who could live anywhere, but will choose to live where there's a quality of life that's important, and that means high quality public infrastructure. Now, one thing that I'd mentioned just a minute ago was that even if you demonstrate a high social return to a project, that's not enough in some instances to entice government down the road of financing, whether directly or using alternate financing mechanisms. But I think that's changing as well. You look at this provincial government, it's increasingly focusing on mechanisms like social returns on investment and cost avoidance. One program that the province adopted dealt with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and it was justified entirely on the basis of social returns on investment, looking at cost avoidance and the benefits accrued over time. I think increasingly you're going to see in a world of financial constraints, provinces will prioritize and they'll start looking at social returns on investment. And by that criteria, infrastructure investments, by their impact on time savings, quality of life, their effect on enhancing transportation, enhancing productivity, their capacity to demonstrate high social returns on investment, I think is going to be make the case much easier. And as I say, in a world of constraints, diminishing tax base, high debt levels, priorities have to be made, and they're probably going to be driven by a greater focus on their social returns on investment. Finally, I think it comes down to political will. If you look at the government of former Premier Ed Stelmach, when the province began running technical deficits, it would have been very easy to balance the budget by reneging on the 3-year capital plan. They did not. Despite the criticisms of running a deficit, even though there was a sustainability fund over here that was being drawn down, he knew it was both a part of a good stimulus package, but also the right thing to do in terms of bang for the buck and returns to investment of taxpayer dollars. You look at the federal government and the Harper government, elected as fiscal hawks, yet 2008, 2009, clearly moved into play with a stimulus package based on infrastructure. So political will is extraordinarily important. You can make the case, but if there's not leadership, not much is going to happen. So as I look out there as to what the pressures are going to be, governments cannot continue to finance infrastructure as they had. There just is not the capacity for them to do that. I think we'll see increasing innovation certainly in Europe, and that's going to cascade to North America. And as it cascades to North America, we know that there are trillions of dollars sitting on the sidelines looking for good investments. You look at pension funds, you look at AIMCO, OMERS, teachers. There's going to be a confluence then of need and requirements for alternate financing by governments, with the capacity then of many of these types of financial entities to mobilize the funds for long-term investment under alternate financing rules. I also suspect as well that as governments are continually squeezed and forced to make priorities, that they will become more selective. We're seeing, the discussion of old age pensions. We're seeing increasing clawbacks on entitlement programs to try and get the money to those that actually need the services as opposed to a generic entitlement program. So for me, I think there's a lot of very positive indicators out there about innovation in the way that we're going to finance capital investment, and it's going to differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, given the governance structure, the legislation, given the players that are involved. So I think alternate financing, it has a strong foot in the door now, but I think within 5 to 10 years, it will be the dominant way of financing government expenditures, just as we see a variety of former government expenditures have now been completely outsourced, with the government just monitoring outcomes. I think that's the world that we see coming down the pike through necessity, as well as by some an interest in doing so. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. I really appreciate your participation this afternoon.
Jeff.
And we, again, have made a donation in your honor to Engineers Without Borders. And we have a little special gift for you here. Now, some of you may not know that last year, when you stepped back from the University of Alberta, you're now acting dean at the University of Winnipeg. So it's
till
not
the end of the month.
Only till the end of the month. Okay,
Yeah,
then this is timely. It's our honorary golf shirt for CSCE 2012, and hopefully you'll have a little bit of time to enjoy some golf this summer.
Thank you.
once you're officially retired. Thanks again. Just a few closing comments, and I want to thank you all again for participating in our program this afternoon. First off, a round of applause for the Shaw staff. The Shaw has unbelievable catering, and the food is always excellent. Thank you to all of them for their hard work. I would invite you after we're all done here in a few minutes to wander through our trade show booth area. There are quite a number of companies and vendors that have products related to our industry that they would like to share that information with you. So please wander through our trade show area. There's also more coffee available over there. And outside, on your way out, please take a moment to look at the artwork that's set up in the lobby. This year, as part of the 125th anniversary celebration, CSCE is starting a new national award for governmental leadership in sustainable infrastructure. And so this award is open now on an annual basis. This will be the first time it's awarded. That will be awarded tonight at our gala. It will be awarded annually to a government agency in Canada, whether it's federal, provincial, or municipal, that is showing extraordinary leadership with sustainable infrastructure. The prize for the winning, and I can't tell you who that is, you'd have to come tonight to find out who that is, but the prize for the winning jurisdiction tonight is going to get a piece of artwork by an Alberta artist that won a competition that was held. So the CSCE is supporting Alberta artists in this case, because the conference is happening here in Alberta. So Alberta artists were invited to a competition to submit artwork. One of those pieces was chosen. It will become the prize tonight to the winning governmental jurisdiction. And the rest of the artwork is actually available for silent auction out in the lobby. So on your way past, please stop by. If you see a piece of art that catches your eye, please make a bid on that artwork. For those conference delegates in the crowd, our technical programs are going to be beginning again back at the West End, so we're going to shuttle you back outside for the conference delegates. The technical sessions will begin at 2 o'clock, and then we'll be back here again tonight for the awards gala, and the reception will be starting at 5:30. So thank you all very much, and thank you to all of our speakers for joining us here today. We really appreciate your participation. Please hang around for a bit, enjoy coffee, see the trade show, and check out the artwork. Thanks again. Have a wonderful day.